I am sitting on the traditional lands of the Wallumedegal people of the Eora Nations, which sits in the lower north shore of Sydney. We would like to, in particular, would like to pay my respects to elders both past, present and future. And we would like, in particular, to pay respects to any lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual and agender brotherhood and sister girl First Nations people attending today. I warmly welcome all the webinar participants out here and that we have with us today, and in particular the speakers, any frontline staff from DCJ districts and our not-for-profit partners. In this FACSIAR Lunch and Learn, we will cover research and evidence about inclusive practices with sexually and gender diverse children and young people, their parents, their carers, family and kin. We have a very busy program today, so I won't spend too long on the introductions. First up are our presenters for this afternoon, Associate Professor Adam Bourne and Dr Luke Gahan. Associate Professor Adam Bourne is an Associate Professor of Public Health and Deputy Director of the Australian Research Centre on Sex, Health and Society at La Trobe University. He leads a large team of research relating to LGBTQI+ health and wellbeing, including studies of mental health and suicidality, family violence and alcohol and other drug use. He was the lead investigator of Writing Themselves in 4, a national survey of the wellbeing of LGBTQI+ young people aged 14 to 21. And Dr Luke Gahan is a sociologist based at the Australian Institute of Family Studies. His research background has included separation and post-separation parenting within same-sex parented families, LGBTQI+, religion and spirituality, same-sex attracted young peoples, health and wellbeing, aging and elder abuse. Luke lives with his husband, Patrick, and the two Siamese cats in Ballarat, Victoria. So we're very keen to hear about your studies. Following these presentations, we will have a short Q&A. Please put any questions for our speakers in the chat box and I will come to these at the end. We will then also move on to the panel discussions. We have a great lineup with the panel members with a range of experience to share in working with sexually and gender diverse children and young people. I'll introduce the panelists after the presenters are finished. I know this is a very interesting topic area, and we're all extremely grateful that our presenters and panel members have taken time out of the busy schedule to shine a light on the issues faced by sexually and gender diverse young people in care, their parents and carers, family and kin, and improve their practice. With that in mind, let's get started. So thank you, please, and go ahead, Associate Professor Adam Bourne.
Thank you so much, Edmundo, for that introduction and the invitation to come and address all of you today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm joining you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. So my task today is to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some of the health and social experiences of LGBTQIA+ young people. So providing an insight into some of the challenges that many can be experiencing and some of the things we can be doing to affirm them in their identities. I'm going to be drawing on data from a study that's called Writing Themselves in 4. This was the 4th iteration of a series of surveys that the centre I work in has been conducting over the last 20 years or so of LGBTQA+ young people aged 14 to 21. The survey was conducted towards the end of 2019, so pre-pandemic times, hold that in mind. And it was a large online survey promoted through social media, a lot on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and through youth and LGBTIQ community organizations. It covers a very broad range of topics. It talks about mental health, community connection, family and intimate partner violence, engagement with LGBTIQ communities, stigma and discrimination, school-based experiences, all manner of things. And I'm just going to give you a handful of kind of snippets of information across that survey to help inform the discussion today. It's quite a large survey, just so you kind of hold in mind kind of what I'm talking to here. The largest of its kind in Australia, with a large representation of people from all across the country, and 1,619 in New South Wales. And it's their particular experiences that I'm talking to today. No, it's not only large, but it's also very diverse. And I make this point deliberately. sometimes I think there can be an impression that LGBTIQ people are a homogenous group of people, that they're all quite similar. And that's true to some extent, but there's also a lot of diversity that exists within the community as well. The same kind of diversity that exists in any part of the Australian society. So we had a large proportion of people who participated who were living with a disability, or who were from a multicultural background, a large proportion who were trans or gender diverse, and a good proportion of people who were Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander as well. The survey report, which is available on our website, and I can put in the chat function later, breaks down the data for all of these different groups so that we can understand them in a bit more detail. The one exception for the time being is among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and that's because we felt it was important that in publishing those data, we did so in partnership with LGBTIQ Indigenous people and their organisations, and that's a process we're working on at the moment, and we should be able to publish that specific set of data towards the end of this year. So to start with, often we talk about within kind of LGBT communities, we talk about a process of coming out, the process of disclosing or talking about your sexuality or gender identity with significant others around you. So one of the first questions we asked in the survey after asking about their identity was have you told other people about this? Who have you come out to? And what you see in this graph here is the proportion of people who had come out to their friends, family, or to their teachers. What you see in the next graph is the proportion of people who said that they felt supported by those people at the point at which they came out to them, with 57% saying they felt supported by their family, 88% by their friends, and 65% by their teachers. What I've shown at the top within those arrows is essentially the gap. It's the proportion of people who didn't feel supported. And that, of course, is something for us to pay particular attention to, because we know that there's such a strong association between feeling supported by significant others and better mental health outcomes for LGBTQIA plus young people. So it's important for us to think about what can we be doing with friends and family and teachers to ensure that they are affirming of young people at the points at which that they do come out to them. The mental health experiences of this population are often, to be frank, extremely concerning. And I do give a content warning always before presenting these particular data. Do take a moment to kind of reflect, to kind of think about some self-care if you do find them, if they kind of are, affecting or unsettling for you. We ask a range of questions around mental health, the first of which was an assessment of psychological distress using a very commonly used measure in this field. And what you see in utilizing that measure is that a very high proportion of people displayed high or very high levels of psychological distress, 81% in fact. And this was even higher among those who were living in rural areas and those who were trans or gender diverse. If you put that in context, here on the left-hand side is the data from our study. On the right-hand side is data from the best available comparison we can find in the general population. And here you see the complete inverse effect. You see a very high proportion of LGBTQIA plus young people, 54%, who have very high levels of psychological distress, compared to what we would see around 11% in the general population. So really, really striking just how different these mental health experiences are. These, I'm afraid, are some of the most concerning data in the whole project, and these relate to experiences of suicide. It was saddening beyond words to see that 26.2% of LGBTQA plus young people in New South Wales had attempted suicide at some point in their lives. And I want you to really reflect on that number. And that's 1 in 4 of young people in this group saying that they had attempted suicide. It is an appallingly high proportion. 10.2% had that experience within the last 12 months. So something that's a very recent and very real experience. And that was, again, it was even more common among those who were aged at the lower end of our age range, 14 to 17, those who are trans or gender diverse, those living with a disability, and those living in a rural area. And again, I want to put that figure in context for you. In the red bar is the LGBTQ people in our sample, and in the grey bar is the general population of young people in Australia, the best comparison that we can find. And what you see is how that experience of attempting suicide in the last 12 months is considerably higher, it's 3 times higher among LGBTQIA+ young people, and 5 times higher if we're looking across their life. I mean, have they ever had that experience? As you think about those mental health related experiences, though, hold in mind the really challenging social and cultural context that LGBTQA+ people still live in here in Australia. And in that respect, we asked a range of questions around their experiences of stigma, discrimination, and assault. And 39.3% of LGBTQIA+ young people in New South Wales experience verbal harassment, specifically relating to their gender identity or sexuality in the past 12 months. 20.8% had experienced sexual harassment, and 8.2% had experienced physical harassment, again, in the last 12 months. This isn't something that was historic. It wasn't something that was happening decades ago in the dim and distant past. I think sometimes people have a perception that this kind of homophobia and transphobia doesn't exist in the same way as it once was. These data tell us that that really isn't the case, and that it's still a very, very real experience for a large proportion of queer young people. We also see those kind of challenging experiences played out in school contexts. 57.7% of those at secondary school felt unsafe or uncomfortable in relation to their gender identity or sexuality in the last 12 months. 64.9% said that they frequently heard negative language regarding sexuality in the last 12 months. And 36.9% said that they deliberately missed days of schools. They were truant from schools because they felt unsafe. And that, of course, is us showing not just the mental health impacts, but also impacts on their education as well. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that everything in the lives of LGBTQIA+ young people is cast in a shadow or is problematic. Alongside those stories of significant mental health challenges, we also heard about the creativity and passion of LGBTQIA+ young people and the things that help make them feel safe. One of the open-ended questions we asked in the survey was, what makes you feel good about yourself? And these were some of the most remarkable data in the whole report. And if you do look at the report, please do have a look at chapter 14, where it describes these in a lot more detail. The findings, I just think, are really beautiful in how they speak to the value that queer young people find in meaningful connection to others, how being affirmed in their gender or sexuality can be the most rewarding experience of all, and how they find ways to express their individuality that makes them feel confident and empowered. Things like clothing swaps to allow them to dress in gender affirming ways. Things like being able to style their hair in the way that they want to decorate their bedrooms in the way that they want to. Having parents or friends who will advocate for them, who will support them, who will go with them to challenge school authorities so they don't feel are being supportive of them, who will stand up for them at that sports club where they feel that they're being kind of mistreated on the basis of their gender and sexuality. Having advocates for them was really, really important. They talked also about the relationships that mattered to them, the ability to engage with other queer young people, other trans and gender diverse people, to know that there are others within the broader LGBTIQ community that they can turn to for help and support. And I guess my parting words really, is saying that if we're to try to improve the health and well-being of LGBTQIA+ young people, if we're to ensure that they feel safe and that they feel supported, then these are the kinds of strengths and values that we can be drawing upon. We can be looking to young people themselves, hearing what they say makes them feel good about themselves, and trying to amplify that as much as we possibly can. I just want to take a quick moment to acknowledge all the people who helped make this kind of project possible. It was funded with generous support from the New South Wales, Victorian, ACT and South Australian governments. So our continued thanks to those. This kind of research is only possible through the combined efforts of a very large group of people, my colleagues at the Centre for Sex Health and Society at La Trobe, a wonderful advisory board of LGBTQIA+ advocates and experts who helped us run the study, and just the most fantastic group of LGBTQIA+ young people whom helped make sure the study was speaking directly to them about the things that mattered most. And with all of that wrapped up, a very quick whistle-stop tour through the key issues, I will hand the microphone over to Luke Gahan, who will guide you through the next part of the presentations. Over to you, Luke.
Hi, everyone. Just set this up. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for having me today. My name's Luke Gahan. As you heard, I'm from the Australian Institute of Family Studies, and the practice guide that I'll be talking about today was produced by AFES and it's based off rapid review of available evidence on inclusive communication with LGBTIQ+ people. The rapid review was undertaken in 2021 and drew on evidence from healthcare and educational settings, including surveys with community samples of LGBTIQ+ people, first-hand accounts, and systematic reviews assessing the evidence on inclusive communication in relation to LGBTIQ+ help seeking. But before I begin, the Australian Institute of Family Studies and myself acknowledge traditional owners throughout Australia on which we gather, live, work and stand. We acknowledge all traditional custodians, their elders past, present and emerging, and we pay respects to their continuing connection to culture, community, land, sea and rivers. And today I'm talking to you from the lands of the Wathaurong people of the Kulin Nation here in Ballarat, Victoria. There we go. Sorry, I just also need to read out that the views expressed in this presentation are those of the authors for the Evidence Practice Guide and may not reflect the views of the Australian Institute of Family Studies or the Australian Government. So firstly, you may notice that the acronym is often different depending on what you are reading. Variations of this acronym exist and depend on the groups being discussed. In the guide that this presentation is about, the acronyms used reflect the research conducted and the available evidence. In other words, each one of the groups reflected in the acronyms, the particular letters we've used, are represented in the findings. So what do we mean by LGBTIQ+ inclusivity? It means both acknowledging and respecting that diversity in sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics are a normal part of life. Inclusive communication is verbal, written, and visual. It is demonstrated by providers being comfortable with LGBTIQ+ language in what you ask or do not ask via your intake forms, and can be visually displayed through having LGBTIQ+ flags or images in your office, promotional material, websites, and handouts. However, inclusive communication must be accompanied by an understanding of the distinct inequalities that LGBTIQ+ communities face and how that shapes their experience seeking help and using services such as your own. In other words, having a rainbow flag in your office or a lanyard is good, but it needs to be backed up by understanding and knowledge. The evidence shows that when service providers make assumptions about their client's sex, gender, or sexuality, it can have negative impacts. Making these assumptions can create barriers to care and increase their stress, anger, and the fear of poor treatment or rejection by you as the provider. It may also prevent your clients from seeking your help or telling you that their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or their intersex status. Not only is it important that your clients feel safe to tell you about their whole selves, their disclosure to you is important as it can provide critical information that will help you best know what types of support you need to give them. Research with transgender and gender diverse young people has also shown that more than half disengaged from school, like Adam was talking about, and a third reported that negative experiences with healthcare professionals had prevented them from seeking mental health care. It is important to note, and I think Adam touched on this also, that LGBTIQ+ communities are not a homogenous group. So that's one reason why I pluralize it. I don't just say the community. There is vast different diversity between each of the letters in the acronym, as well as within those individual letters. It's important to remember, just like any other group or person, members of the LGBTIQ+ communities have other parts of their lives. They may come from an ethnic minority background, they may be religious, they may have physical or mental health challenges. For this reason, it's important to remember to take a client-centered approach with your clients. The research demonstrates that LGBTIQ+ people feel most included when providers use an affirmative approach, go beyond assumptions, and demonstrate competence with language. And I'll briefly explain each of these. An affirmative approach is one where you provide a proactive and positive reception to individuals and their families. You understand that sexual orientation, gender identity, and variations of sex characteristics are different concepts and relate to each other in different ways for all people across their life course. To go beyond assumptions, you will use questions that do not assume a person's sex, gender, or sexuality. You will also have an awareness that sex characteristics and gender do not exist as a binary. That is, that there's more than two sexes and more than two genders. Finally, to demonstrate competence with language, you'll appear comfortable using the inclusive language. So it's good to know the language and it's good to understand it, but it's most important to feel comfortable using it. Appearing to be uncomfortable or looking uneasy can become a barrier to service provision. You'll also be willing, or should also be willing, to allow clients to be themselves and use their chosen terms, such as pronouns. And at the end of the presentation, I do have a link where you can find a glossary of common terms that might be helpful. So what does the evidence say on what you can do as practitioners? Firstly, communicate in a way that welcomes LGBTIQ+ clients, avoid assumptions, but also talk openly with clients and protect their privacy. Importantly, take the lead from clients, recognize different preferences for disclosure and whether the client's disclosure is in fact relevant to the service that you're providing. Learn those common terms and consider how sexual orientation, gender identity, and variations of sex characteristics may influence their service, the service that they require, such as their networks of support. Signal inclusivity to all your clients. Place posters or stickers in your office, wear a rainbow lanyard, but as I said before, remember, only do this if you're ready to meet the expectations that come with this. A great thing to do is to participate in training. There are a number of training packages that can increase your knowledge and, importantly, your confidence. And I think confidence is one of the most important things that we underestimate here. Finally, know what specialist services for LGBTIQ+ care are available and make appropriate referrals when issues are beyond mainstream service expertise. So what can your organisation do as a whole? Well, firstly, it's good for organisations to do an audit of your content, such as websites, brochures, and update the content to ensure it is inclusive. Have a look at website images or perhaps the way you talk about families in your brochures. Are they inclusive of LGBTIQ+ people? An important change is the development of inclusive registration forms and privacy protocols. These allow your clients and families to be recognised and included. The ABS have good standards for collecting information, and actually one that I prefer, and I know you guys through New South Wales, but the Victorian government have a great site outlining the data collection standards for LGBTI communities, and it's well worth having a look at that, which they co-designed with communities. Most importantly, you want to ensure that all staff have adequate knowledge of LGBTIQ+ issues and needs, to ensure that clients and their families' expectations are met when they interact with others in the organisation. So that includes everyone in the organisation, right down to if you have a receptionist, include them in the training. You need everyone to be on the same page. The best training that I know of is Rainbow Tick, which was designed by Rainbow Health it's Rainbow Health at La Trobe University. Inclusive communication involves a proactive approach to learning about and affirming diversity. It's not just about being an expert. In fact, it's not really about being an expert. When looking to adopt inclusive language, there isn't a single set of terms that results in inclusive communication. Little evidence exists on when, how, and how much to acknowledge diversity in service interactions. However, the evidence does suggest that when practitioners go beyond the assumptions, affirm diversity, and display competence in that language, it can improve service engagement and may have a beneficial impact on the health and wellbeing outcomes of LGBTIQ+ people. ACE have a number of publications that you can access from their website, and this link, and I believe you get access to these slides after, this link will take you to where you can download the guide I'm talking about today. And if you scroll down further in that page, you'll find links to further reading, which includes a glossary of common terms and a webinar from 2017 about working with gender diverse young people and their families. So thanks everyone, and I'll hand back now to Edmundo.
Thanks so much, Luke and Adam. Really fantastic insights that you shared from your research. Certainly some sobering figures from Adam that you shared that I think all of us can sort of make us stop and reflect, you know, when working and supporting young people that may be coming out, to really keep that in mind and find those connections for them. And look, I think you made some really great points about inclusive language. I'll be honest, even though I've been an out gay man since, you know, for the last 20, 30 years, I'm still learning. Even being part of this panel, I've learned a few things about the importance of pronouns and using inclusive language. Look, we have about 10 minutes for any questions from our audience members, so please put them in the chat. Maybe while we're waiting, if I can go to you, Adam, one of the points that has come up previously for our DCJ LGBTQI+ consultants is that a young person's risk of self-harm or suicide is greatly reduced when they are recognised and respected by those closest to them, such as family, friends, or care providers. And I think you even mentioned probably teachers in your research. So does this obviously ring true with your research, and anything else you can elaborate on?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. There's almost no more significant thing you could do than affirm and support a person at the point at which they come out to you. And that can, as I was kind of alluding to, that can take a whole variety of forms. That's being accepting from the point of disclosure for one. You know, acting as an advocate for your child or young person in settings where they are receiving a hostile reaction. And unfortunately, that does still happen in school contexts, far more so than we would ever likely like to see. It happens in sporting contexts. And we shouldn't be requiring young people to do all of the labor that is needed to overcome those problems by themselves. They need allies, and they need people who will stand up and kind of fight and advocate for them to say this isn't acceptable practice. There needs to be the introduction of gender neutral toilets in these, you know, in whichever environment it is that we're talking about. You need to ensure that you're using more inclusive language in the classroom. You need to ensure that if you're talking about sex education, for example, then you're talking about it in ways that are inclusive of LGBTQIA+ young people. So yes, and pronouns. I can see a whole range of people making comments around pronouns in the chat. Don't underestimate just how important that is for trans and gender diverse young people, really. I was presenting last week at a trans health conference in Darwin, and we were talking about data, a separate bit of data from the study where we asked trans young people, what helps affirm your gender identity? And the most common response was people saying, if others around them can acknowledge and respect their identity by utilizing the appropriate name and their pronouns. But we saw that over 50% of trans and gender diverse young people were misgendered on a daily basis. So this is something that happens all the time. It means a lot to them, but it's something that others around them aren't always respecting. And that, I think, it just kind of it tells us that, you know, it's something we all have to raise our game on. I think every one of us, you know, has found it challenging to kind of switch sometimes. I think, you know, when you've been used to engaging with a person using one pronoun for a very long time, and then they affirm their identity differently, it can take a little while for your to kind of mentally switch and to think about using it in an everyday basis. But just try as hard as you can. If you get it wrong, acknowledge that and correct it. And that's one of the most valuable things I think you can be doing.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Look, I can see a few questions coming along. Really, people want to really want to use the correct terminology and they're worried that they're going to get it wrong. So look, I might bring you in here. Some of these questions may be applicable for you. I've got here, as a parent of a son in the LGBTQI community, if I address someone with the wrong pronoun by accident, what is a good way to acknowledge and correct my error? And there's another one that just, again, the use of rainbow community, is that an okay replacement for the LGBTQI acronym? Your thoughts, Adam or Luke?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd say rainbow community, generally speaking, particularly among young people, is a perfectly acceptable, informal, collective term. It's used pretty widely, I would say. So yeah, I think fine in an informal context in that respect. And the other question, I'm sorry, I've lost the thread of already. I can't hold two in my head.
One of the members of the audience were just wondering, I guess if they use the wrong terminology, what's the best approach to sort of correct themselves, and obviously that fear of offending someone or making it worse?
Absolutely. Look, I will put in the chat a link to a document that some colleagues at Switchboard Victoria, Queer and LGBTIQ mental health support line, created last year, which addresses exactly this point. I mean, briefly, it's about acknowledging. It's about not trying to pretend it didn't happen. And kind of acknowledging and saying, I'm so sorry. I think I realized that I utilized the wrong pronoun. I'll endeavor to do better in the future. People make mistakes, and the vast majority of people will understand that. I think the one thing is just to be mindful of not necessarily drawing attention to that in contexts where people maybe feel less comfortable. So if it's in a large group situation, if it's in the someone's presenting, for example, and you misgender there, just be mindful of, is that a conversation they want to be having in a much more public forum, or would it be better for you to kind of, take them aside afterwards and say, I'm really sorry about that. I want to acknowledge that I misgendered you. I really will try harder to use the right pronoun in the future. But I'll see if I can find that document. I'll pop it in the chat.
Thanks, Adam. Luke, what are your thoughts on these questions?
I think Adam answered that second one perfectly. I mean, I've actually been in that situation. I think it's important to note that people who are within the LGBTIQ plus communities also do that as well. And I think I'm glad to hear that I did it exactly as Adam suggested, and apologise. And look, one thing that I've got better at doing over the years when I was lecturing at a university was using people's names and just using they, them, there for everyone, and then listening for the response. And you get better at that over time. And I think the same thing of the question around rainbow communities, listening to how people describe their community that they belong to. Not all people will identify necessarily with the entire acronym and may not like using that. And I think that's an important thing to acknowledge too. And look, I've worked with older people in my research, and older people often, on the age range, different generations have very different language. So listening out for that language is quite important.
Thank you, Luke. I can see there's a lot of questions. People really want to understand what some of the support services are out there to help them educate themselves, or really questions about how can they support people in care settings. And I'm pretty sure it's probably quicker for us. There will be a few links when this goes up in our website, for the FACSIAR website, that you can actually access. So I might leave those ones rather than talking through them. Look, I think we're almost running out of time, but look, if I can just go one more question for you, which kind of looks at the other side of what the harmful effects. So again, something that's raised by DCG LGBTQI consultants is that modeling is important, using the right language, as well as challenging disrespectful or harmful language and behaviors. So does that align with your findings as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always important to model that. And I think, as I've said in the presentation too, is really backing up what you do and say, within your organization, modeling it is important as well. And I think ensuring that everyone is able to come along that journey. I think one thing that people forget often is that everyone takes their time to get to some of these places it takes people different lengths of time, in other words. So you can model the best practice and ensure that people have the ability to come along that journey with you, but don't expect people to change immediately overnight as well.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you both, Professor Bourne and Dr. Luke Gahan. I guess that we've heard it's really up to us to educate ourselves and to respond to and work with young people that are sexually and gender diverse. As our presenters have shown, the use of inclusive and affirming language is not that hard, and it could potentially be life-saving for a lot of young people out there. So we'll now finish this part of the webinar. I stop recording and we'll move on to the live panel discussions. So thank you so much again, Luke and Adam, and obviously hopefully you're able to stick around in case we get any more questions that we can direct at you. So let me now